Welcome back to another edition of Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corp Institute of Public Policy and Economy. I'm your host, Sebastian Lebrecq. I had so much fun talking about sports in the last episode on sports diplomacy in the media that I decided to record another one to wrap up the winter-spring season of the podcast. This time, we're talking about what it takes to get to the highest levels of sports. Countries and sports federations are constantly thinking about how to enable high-performance athletes to perform on the world stage and win medals. Money and government support is a big piece of the puzzle, but it's not the only one. For instance, the right infrastructure and skilled coaches also make a big difference. I wanted to explore these different dimensions to learn more about how Canada is faring when it comes to high-performance sports. And we're lucky because the president of AthletesCAN, Susanne Wereley, accepted our invitation to come on the show. Susanne has a wealth of expertise and experience when it comes to high-performance sports. She's a two-time Olympian in rowing, an Olympic gold medalist, and a multiple-time World Championship medalist. Thank you so much for being here. Okay, so let's start by setting the context. I mentioned your organization, AthletesCAN. So what should our listeners know about this organization?
AthletesCAN is truly the voice of Canadian national team athletes. So we're the association of over 6,000 current and recently retired athletes. We have members in Canada across 68 different sports, including Olympic, Paralympic, Pan Am, Para-Pan Am, and the Commonwealth Games. So truly, if you are a national team athlete, like we are here to help you feel heard and to make sure that athlete voices are involved in main decision making across the Canadian sports system.
I mentioned in the introduction that you're a two-time Olympian and a gold medalist. I'd be curious to hear more about your own journey becoming a decorated high-performance athlete.
Yeah, I would say it was relatively long. I started rowing when I was about 13. My parents had just done a really big move with all of us across the country, and I think I was a fairly angsty teenager looking back at it now, and they were just desperate to have me do something outside of the house and, extracurricular burn off all of that anger, I guess. But um, one of their family friends was the coach of the high school rowing team, and I am fairly tall. I'm 6'2", and so I'd heard all my life, like, oh, you have so much potential in sport. Like, you'd be so good at basketball, volleyball, like golf. And like, I tried everything, but I always heard like potential, potential. And so, um, Bob, the coach, was like, oh, like, have you ever heard of rowing? And I was like, no, never heard of rowing. What's that? And he was like, well, you should come try it. Like, being tall, like you would actually be quite good at it. I was like, I've heard this before. So my dad and I went out to the boathouse, and Bob taught me how to use a rowing machine, and he put me in a big tub single, it's essentially like a canoe with oars. And it was the first sport that I tried that I actually felt if I put the hard work in, I saw progress. And so maybe it was a combination of that and the coach just like helping recognize those things for me, but it sort of just snowballed from there. I never really thought immediately I'd go to the Olympic level. I am a very competitive person, so I was like, yes, I'll say to myself, like, I'd love to be an Olympian someday. That's so cool. But didn't know what it meant to climb the system or go through it all. So just started rowing in high school, and it kind of went on from there. Every step of the ladder, luckily, I had a support person to help me navigate the next level, and I've ended up where I am today, as an Olympic gold medalist.
That's a pretty nice journey. And it's funny because in your answer, you mentioned, you tried a bunch of different sports. And I think, getting kids to try a sport is one thing, but keeping them involved is another. So are we good? Are we doing a good job in this country at progressing promising athletes through this continuum?
I think we could probably do a little bit better. I think we're turning the corner on this now. I think that from my own experience, it was just a little bit confusing as to what it meant to truly kind of progress through that and stay in sport if you wanted to be on a more competitive level. Um, I do think it's getting better today. I think that we're recognizing in Canada the benefit to having sport in our lives, and having young kids, young adults sort of stay in sport. So I do think that there's some progress happening, but I think that there's a longer ways to go until we truly can say like, yes, we are a fully successful country at doing this.
So it's interesting because we're talking about retention in the context of climbing up the ladder, but then at some point you get, on top of the ladder. We're just a few months removed from the Winter Olympic Games, and there are a lot of athletes that are trying to decide if they want to stick around for another quadrennial. It's interesting because I'm a huge figure skating person, and I saw that Skates Canada released its assignments for the ISU series, and we got to see, okay, some skaters are coming back, some skaters are taking a year off. So a lot of factors go into that decision. So could you tell us about retention in the context of high performance sport?
Yeah, it's a challenge at high performance level. I think because in certain sports, people are still quite young, but in particularly in rowing, just as an example, speak to what I know the best. Rowers tend to be more so like 20s to 30s, I would say. Like the average rower is late 20s. So it's at that point, you're thinking of other things. If you want to start a family, you want to settle into a career. And so retention can be quite difficult if those support systems aren't in place around you to make you feel like you're not going to be one step behind when you do eventually leave your sport career behind. So I think that there are improvements that have been made now in a lot of sports, or even just in the Canadian system to say like, okay, if you're an athlete competing in X, like here's what's available to you as far as continuing education while you're training. And it is a hurdle for sure because every sport is different with what's possible and what can be done, with even just your own like logistical scheduling. But I do think that we're making progress on uh, supporting athletes in, going back to school or having a baby and then being able to come back into training. I think we're starting to see that these are things we need to be supporting. And it's a big thing too at AthletesCAN that we're really trying to make sure that athletes know what resources are available to them and have that be something they can find and reach out about. But yeah, I think in the past couple of years we've come a long way.
So you mentioned your organization obviously helps members. I'm curious when you say that things have gotten better. Is it that sports federations are doing a better job at thinking about the post-competitive year?
I think it's a combination of the like actual government funding sort of being truly bucketed for things like this, as well as federations realizing like, oh, we're losing athletes to life. Like they want to move on, they want to do what's next, versus them say like realizing like, oh, you could still be in this if we make it obvious and clear to you about how you could go to school and train with an independent training program that you're like checking in with us on. And so if these things are possible, I think that federations are realizing like, oh, we're turning over athletes pretty quickly here. Like we need to figure something else out. And then too, with funding being like, okay, here's maybe extra support for like child dependency or like parents coming back to training. Like I think that there's more awareness around that and a need for that.
So obviously we talk about training. In order to train, you usually need infrastructure. So I know this is a bit of a broad question, but at a high level, what is the state of high performance infrastructure in Canada?
So if you'd asked me this question a year ago, I would have said that we're struggling. I think today we've turned a corner. I think that there's now some things in place and definitely more of a seeming a plan of understanding that, in order to continue to succeed on the world stage in sport, we're going to need infrastructure like at home on the ground for every single level of sport. It's that accessibility point and, an excitement. You want to be able to see as a kid, have a place to go where you feel comfortable and it's available to you. And so I think that um, there are some changes being made. I know with the big the spring economic update and the sport funding that was announced, a large portion of that is for infrastructure. And there was in the previous budget, there was also an announcement made around some infrastructure funding. So I know that there is a lot in the future that is going to start to go towards this. So I think that Canada is recognizing that we need to up our game.
So you mentioned infrastructure, even in the context of local communities. So I kind of want to ask you about this. You mentioned when we were talking offline this phrase that I thought was really interesting: playground to podium. Could you tell us about the link between community infrastructure and high performance sports?
Yeah, absolutely. I can't take credit for that phrase. That was the Secretary of Sport Adam Van Koeverden. So he shared with us that plan, and I think it's wonderful. But I think that the true focus and funding around every level, and that we can no longer look at national team athletes and like all the way down to grassroots, like club level as a separate participation thing. Like one feeds into the other. And so it's, I think, really important that as a young athlete, you have a place to train if that's, what you need for your sport, that's accessible, that's available. It's important to have things like this to keep somebody in sport. I mean, as a kid, maybe I'm just overly excited. I thought it was super cool to be able to go into like a nice new arena when I was trying all sorts of other sports, or, be able to um, have a great tennis court to go and try out the sport. And so I think that these are things that if they hadn't been around or accessible, I wouldn't have been able to try the sport. And so I do think that focusing about like this on all levels is crucial because you have to start somewhere.
And obviously, many sports have national training centers. I'm curious whether or not these training centers create a bit of a positive buzz in the community around the sport, and perhaps they even facilitate interactions between up and coming athletes and high performance athletes.
When I was rowing at the training center in Ontario before it shifted, I definitely had experiences on both sides actually. When I was young, I rowed out of that boathouse as a club athlete. And it was the same boathouse that the national team women trained out of. And so I actually saw them every day in the same change room, in the same boathouse. Their boat was next to mine, getting out, compete, like going out training. And one of them came and spoke at my school one day and actually like met me, and I got to say hi to them. And so then moving forward, when I saw her at the boathouse, she said hi to me every single time I saw her. And I remember that was like life changing for me. I was like, she knows who I am. And she's an Olympian. Like, how cool is that? And so it made me excited to come to practice. And I saw that she was just a person, as silly as that sounds. Like, she's normal. Like, I could be that. It seemed very attainable looking at her at that point. Like, oh, like she comes to practice, she trains, she puts in the hard work, and she goes home. Like, that's what everybody does. You just have to continue to do it at every level. And so I think when I eventually did make it to the national team level and was the person in her shoes, I tried very hard to make sure that I was aware of what I was putting off to anyone else who was at the boathouse. And there were people who were excited, and I got asked to talk to some of the athletes that were up and coming in the club system as well. And it was then I made an effort to like say hi. And so yeah, there was definitely some excitement, and I recognized how much it made a difference in my life, and seeing that is super cool. So yeah, I think national training centers definitely have an impact on the community and the um, athletes that might be our next national team athletes in the future.
It's interesting because when we watch the Olympics, we look at the athletes and, they look like these superhumans that, it's almost intimidating. And the story you just told, I love that because it just shows that, yeah, I love what you said. At the end of the day, they're still humans and just with a fantastic power to inspire the next generation. So that's fantastic to hear. So having good infrastructure is one thing, but you can only go so far if you don't have good coaches. So thinking of high performance sports specifically, do we do a good job developing coaches in Canada?
I think it's hard. I think we have some wonderful coaches in Canada. I think that the gap between club level coaching and national team level coaching is one that there's some like uncertainty is as far as like how big that jump will truly be. And so I do think that there's some great coaching happening at all levels, but I think we need to do a better job of providing like coach education and like pathway support for those that want to continue up the coaching level, because even until you're right before the national team level coaching, oftentimes there's a huge handful of them who are volunteers. They're still doing this off the side of their desk, as to like so to say, um, in a very committed way, but it is a volunteer role. And so I think that it would be helpful to have some extra support for coaches that then do want to try to take that next step to the national level, or, are very pleased and happy with the level that they're at, but want to continue to be a better coach in that realm. And so I think that there are resources out there, but that there should be some more structured requirements for all levels to make sure that we're continuing to educate coaches, have resources for coaches and athletes alike with that relationship available, and then too those that want to take that next jump, because it is a large jump.
So you mentioned the spring economic update and the money that was announced, 755 million to support sports in Canada. So I know you're in communications with the government of Canada, providing your insight as the president of AthletesCAN. What would be your top 3 advice to the government of Canada as it rolls out the funding? Because announcing it is one thing, but then the money's got to flow at some point and make a difference.
Yeah, so we, as AthletesCAN, we did put together a proposal for the Future of Sport in Canada report, which was sort of our like big um, things that we thought needed to be focused on with a change in the sports system and additional funding. I would say our big one that is a huge mandate for us all the time is to require athlete representation at all levels of the sports system. It's a big thing that we're working on right now, and we're actually starting a bit of a research project to say just what that level of athlete representation should be, like how many athletes on a board, what percentage need to be involved, and in a very meaningful, purposeful way. I think that there are some areas where it's just not happening, and so I think it's a big thing that we are trying to push for. We also think it's necessary to simplify and clarify the sports system. And so I think even with this funding, looking at sort of getting rid of some redundancies to make the funding go further is a big thing that we've pushed for. And then really funding all parts of the athletes support system from the grassroots up. So we have about, coach retention, and it goes further than that in my mind as far as like their support system. So whether it's a physio, strength and conditioning. And so I think having that support system around athletes at all levels funded and accessible then makes the retention for athletes and for those support staff alike more of a thing that we'll continue to see in the sports system. So I think it's quite needed at this level. And one other thing that we're working on actually at the moment is to help recommend to the government where we think the additional funding for the athlete assistance program should be dispersed at the national team level. So we're really working right now to gather all the athlete voices and get their thoughts and feelings on this, and make sure that they're heard in the process as well.
Well, thank you very much for this conversation. I was really excited to wrap up the year with a discussion on high performance sports, and our last few minutes together were extremely interesting. I think you did a phenomenal job explaining, the athlete's journey, but also why infrastructure and coaches matter, and what comes next in terms of government funding. So thank you so much for taking the time today.
Yeah, thank you. It was great to chat.
Thank you for listening to Unintended Consequences. The views expressed during this podcast are not necessarily the views of Strategy Corp. All rights for this episode are reserved, and the guests on the Intended Consequences podcast might be current or past clients of Strategy Corp. To find out more about the work of the Institute and to subscribe to our newsletter, visit our website at strategycorp.com/institute, and make sure to follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. I'm Sebastian Lebrec, and I intend to talk to you again next episode.